All right, let me welcome everyone here today to Cold War Study Seminar. This will be the next to last seminar in this series for this semester. The final one is on the 12th of December. That will be an online webinar dealing with human rights and repression, both during the Cold War and after. Today's seminar is about a subject that this center, the Davis Center, when it was known as the Russian Research Center, as it was set up in the late 1940s, dealt with directly and also fundamentally. It was a center, as both of our speakers today will discuss, that basically became, along with the Russian Institute at Columbia, became one of the two foremost institutions to promote the study of the Soviet Union. And I will say no more about it now, but we'll turn first. The two speakers are first Slavomir Lukashevich, who is a professor of political science at Catholic University in Lublin. He's also the director of the Institute of Central Europe there, and has been working on a book that deals with some of the American Sovietologists of Polish descent, and that includes a fair number who were at Harvard. I won't say more about them, except that I knew, I think, all but one of them, because they were here when I started at Harvard. There are some other people here who were, also knew them even better, like Nina Tumarkin. Steve Solnick certainly knew most of them. And so there, I welcome, and Roman Shmurluk. So I welcome input from people during the discussion period. Let me also introduce the second speaker will be Nadia Boyajieva, who is a professor of international law and international relations at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. She is also professor of international law at Plovdiv University and a long-term visiting scholar here at the Davis Center. So with that, let me turn first to Slavik, please.
Mark, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you for coming here to the seminar. One small correction, I'm not director of the Institute of Central Europe. I work only there coping with some historical issues. What I would like to tell today for you is based on two projects which I'm conducting for years. The first one started 6 years ago with my first stay here at Davis Center, thanks to Fulbright Commission. And when I started to ask some questions generally about the beginnings of Soviet studies, the role which was played by the emigres. And the second project is very basic approach to write a biography of Adam Ulam. Nina Tumarkin, who is here, let's say, knows this perfectly. I'm struggling with the topic also for years, trying to glue all the parts of the mirror, which is not a very easy task. But I can tell this more in the discussion. Here, I would like to focus more on general issues. Maybe it's important that the second was financed up till now by Kościuszko Foundation, by also American Philosophical Society, which granted me a franking grant to finish the research here. And thanks to this, together with my colleagues from the university, I visited many archives, trying to gather some materials to fulfill some gaps, which can be treated as also a comment to two fundamental books, I think. The first is, surprisingly, by Miroslav Filipovich. He's a director of Institute of Central Europe today. And he wrote about American historians of Russia, trying to prove the thesis that a very important role and historiography, American historiography on Russia, was played by Russian emigres. As that they came to the United States, and such persons like Karpovich, Yazanovsky, Florinsky, some others, they played an extremely important role in framing certain research approach toward the issue. And when I've read David Engerman book, which was discussed also here at the center, there was something missing for me, as that there is no this emigre aspect, emigre factor in this book. However, the book is seminal, and we need to read this. And I do not want to repeat, let's say, what Engerman already wrote. But I would like to supplement some of his findings, trying to shed a light on this issue of relations between American Sovietology, its beginning, and let's say the role of the emigres, which they played. And to start this, I will try to divide the presentation into two parts. The first is generally about Sovietology as a part of Cold War framework, because Sovietology was not only the science which was built, or the research which was built, but also it was built for certain purpose, for certain political purpose, at least at the beginning. Yes, later, of course, we had many of discussions. However, at the beginning, it was necessary to answer some very urgent questions asked by government and administration. I will give you some examples of this just in a moment. And then I will tell you more about the project we conducted, trying to map the Sovietologists who originated from Poland, to tell a few words about the effects of our research, and then to tell a few more words about their role and how, after 6 years of research, I'm trying to assess this. Of course, we need to first of all realize that emigres were the part of different types of warfare, Cold Warfare. First, the framework was cultural Cold War. I hope you know the book by Sanders, but also by others, trying to explain the emergence of Congress for Cultural Freedom. Everywhere, emigres were very strongly involved. I can give you the names like, for example, Konstanty Jeleński, a person very close to Kultura, Jerzy Giedroyć in Paris, and who, thanks to his connections, to his networks, was able to cooperate with American colleagues, with other Central European emigres, other Russian emigres within the Congress, to finance such famous press titles like Encounter, The Monad, Press, Soviet Survey, or the latest survey, and many others. So cultural Cold War took place on this level of writing, arts, academia to a certain extent, and in certain moment also in cultural or intellectual exchanges between so-called then Western world and socialist bloc controlled by the Soviet Union. Psychological warfare maybe is better known to you thanks to existence of National Committee for Free Europe and Free Europe Committee, which also financed a lot of initiatives where emigres were involved. Also with the attempt, just recently I worked on the papers in Philadelphia, where attempt of creation of Central and East European Research Institute was launched in early 50s, thanks to some emigres. Generally it failed, but let's say under umbrella of Free Europe Committee, there was European Studies Center. There were many different units, as well as some research units within Radio Free Europe itself, gathering some materials, trying to analyze them, and this is what we need to know. And then the expertise, because I think that the most valuable part of the emigres, and this is why they were treated quite seriously from the beginning, it was the expertise, proficiency in English. For example, also some personal experiences, some networks, some ability to adapt to new circumstances. And at this moment, I need to make a distinction between at least two generations of immigrants. The elder generation and the new generation. I could give you more examples if you are interested. The elder generation simply was derived from a certain tradition of Sovietology we had in Poland before the war, of interwar Sovietology. Why the new generation, like Ulam, like Pipes, like colleagues, yes, who came here to the United States, they were quite young and they had their main education here in the United States, and they became the part of American academia. So it was one of the main difference between two generations, and also between their career paths. What deserves another approach. And when I was trying together with my colleagues to map them, yes, where they transferred with their expertise, with their skills, trying to act as the advisors, trying to act as some experts, as academics, and so on. The first thing is that many of them were located in London, Paris, Munich, also in Switzerland, also in Franco, Spain, what can be a bit surprising, but Franco simply supported any type of anti-communist activity, and this is why some immigrants found themselves also in Spain. However, London, it was the city with the biggest part of Polish immigrant community. Paris also very important. Munich because of Radio Free Europe, and in Switzerland there were some centers with such persons like Father Bocheński, who was specialist in Marxist philosophy. Yes, or together with some other colleagues also from the United States. And thanks, for example, to Rockefeller Foundation, he was able to conduct some research. But many of them, especially of young people, decided to come here to the United States because, like in the theory of migration studies, United States, it was very strong magnet. It was very strong pulling factor, yes, that let's say allowing them to think about their career, about security, about more free expression than in many other parts of the world. So it was very attractive, and of course this slide is very preliminary because we have the whole list of the institutions where they affiliated on different levels, being sometimes professors, sometimes librarians, sometimes archivists. However, they worked as the experts. And I would like to focus for a moment on this center, which was Russian Research Center, established in 1948, with many distinguished persons, starting with Adam Ulam. He's first on the list because he was the first from this group who got his PhD in 1947. He studied with Friedrich, with Melfeinzot, with Karpovich, so with very distinguished already professors of Harvard. But then to this group you have to add Richard Pipes also, who got his PhD just a while later. Then you have also Marian Kamil-Dziewanowski, and then also Zbigniew Brzeziński, who came as the last from the, let's say, Cambridge 4 or something, yes. How would you like to describe them? However, this is not the whole list of people connected with Harvard. and with Slavic studies on, for example, field of literary studies like Letnicki, Weintraub, or Barańczak, or also I'm including here Professor Sporluk, who is among us, and let's say who can comment on this later. I'm very curious about this. But what I want to explain through this, that you have the whole list of people who came from Poland, who were in different ways connected with Poland, and who, for example, participated in regular seminars like Alexander Ehrlich, who got the PhD like Rożek, Krakowska-Harmston, Mark Neuwirth, Samuel Pizar, George Berdaj, who had different names, what is fascinating itself, let's say, to go into such biography when he was changing, maybe like something escaping from a certain danger. So, together with some sociologists, because you have here Talcott Parsons, you have Margaret Mead, you have Ruth Benedict, and let's say, but also Clyde Kluckhohn, who was the first director of the center. They all belong to the first part of people dealing with Russia and the Soviet Union, and they use their skills quite unique in this moment. Yes, maybe you remember this fragment from David Engersman's book when he is giving the diagnosis that the number of people who are fluent in Russian or any type of Central and Eastern European languages in academia or in other units dealing with the region, it was a very small one. Yes, we are talking about a few or several people at the beginning, and then of course the number was bigger and bigger. However, it was necessary to have them inside. And of course, they built some professional networks between them. They built some networks within academia. I think that the huge part of, for example, Adam Ulam's career at the beginning was thanks to Mel Fazot, to the fact that he wrote some student papers for Carl Friedrich and some other persons, yes, influenced his career. Similarly, when you have Zbigniew Brzeziński and many others. So this is the moment when they let's say started to play a certain role and to build something which I think Engelman missed is in his book, is that they were a certain universe within the universe of the Soviet studies, which I think it's important to emphasize. And here you see our attempt. Of course, this is not mine. This is by my colleague, sociologist Kamil Filipek, who is working on such visualizations. The plan is that you can click on every spot and you can see what are the connections between different peoples thanks to institutional affiliations. Yes, we base this on institutional affiliations. So when they were gathered within, for example, Russian Research Center or somewhere, we'll see this on this graph. And here you have also another information, which is, from my point of view, very important, that somewhere in this interwar period, there was this biggest group and the most consolidated. They were born in the interwar period, and then they moved, and they played a very important role in this American and Western part of Sovietology, while the elder group was not so big, was not so dynamic, was not so consolidated, and it for sure was a certain obstacle. However, not for everyone. Yes, and there were some exceptions from this. And of course, we are trying, as I said, to list all the centers which were affiliated, starting, of course, with University of Warsaw, because it was very often the place where they were educated. But you see how big eventually is the number of persons which were identified with only Russian Research Center. As from the first generation, we have 5, from the second, 17, and two from, let's say, the other generation. So altogether, I think it is 24 persons who appeared somehow here in this place. And similarly, you can try to identify them for Radio Free Europe, London School of Economics, Columbia University, also very big numbers, I think. Generally, we are doing this, and I hope in a moment you will see or you will read an article gathering all those findings in one. And now to give you a certain taste of not only the numbers and networks they created, but also of certain potential of the expertise they had and they produced. And starting with this elder generation, where Włodzimierz Bączkowski belonged, who was a certain authority for so-called Prometheism in interwar Poland. Yes, the conception that it is necessary to co-work with different nations of the Soviet Union, counting that that Soviet Union in the future will be dismembered, thanks to this cooperation. And he published just after the war the book titled Towards an Understanding of Russia. I have to say that this book only recently, 2 years ago or something, was translated into Polish. So there was not Polish translation of this until the current director of Eastern Studies Center in Poland decided to do this. This example shows another thing, that not only Richard Pipes at the beginning of his road coped with some nationalities questions within the Soviet Union. His first book was dedicated especially to this. He cooperated with MIT on Soviet vulnerability program, trying to show what are the most vulnerable parts of the Soviet Union. But also there was another book which is a discovery for me, I should say, Walter Kolarz, who was of Polish-Czech origins, who was also a journalist working with BBC. You see that iconography is quite, let's say, telling. And then once again, Walter Kolarz, because I think, Mark, it is something also I discovered that the same year when Mel Feinsod published for the first time How Russia is Ruled, you had also Walter Kolarz, How Russia is Ruled. Yes, the same title. What means that they ask similar questions, at least. Of course, the book is different, as it's not so well organized. It's more in journalist style, not well systematically described like in Feinsod's work. However, I think it is quite interesting. And of course, a person connected here with this younger generation and with the Russian Research Center, with Harvard, was Brzezinski. To a certain extent, the person who built the foundations for so-called totalitarian paradigm, yes, in Soviet studies, where, let's say, totalitarianism was discussed, because it was discussed not only by Brzezinski, but generally in this milieu. And once again, for a moment, this is the example of completely forgotten research conducted by Viktor Sukienicki. He is from this first generation, from the older generation. But when he came here to the United States, he was not able to fit into the requirements of academia. And eventually, he became a pure researcher at Hoover Institution, working for Drashkovich and preparing some research study on Cominform and different incarnations of Cominform, and they were never published. And so he gathered a lot of research material for this. And coming back now, it is the comparison of the elder generation and the new one. The elder was by Stanisław Sieniewicz, who wrote a book, I'm sorry, it is not the first copy I have, Forced Labor and Economic Development. It is mostly about the system of Gulag, which in his opinion was built and used especially for economic purposes, as he focused on the value of the system for Soviet economy. On the other side, of course, you have also seminal work by Ulam about foreign policy of the Soviet Union. And I hope you feel at least that, let's say, this expertise of the emigres. It is another question how they identified themselves. Yes, of course, U.S. professors or they belong to American academia. But for me, I think this is the story which is not fully understandable without the origins. And of course, Brzezinski, you see him on the picture with Ulam and Hariman drinking coffee or something, and probably exchanging some views on the Soviet Union. There's also an anecdote, I can tell you this later, about Hariman and Brzezinski, because Hariman simply treated Brzezinski with suspicion because he said, you are Polish origins, so you cannot be objective when you are talking about Russia. Yes, and there was an answer of this of Brzezinski, which eventually led to the cooperation later. And after all, of course, I cannot state that all of them were in favor of this totalitarian paradigm. There were also some cases of Sovietologists or experts in Soviet Union who were anti this paradigm. One of the most famous is Isaac Deutscher, for example. He also was from Poland, yes, and we cannot, let's say, exclude him from this set of names. However, most of them were rather leaning into this direction. And the whole discussion which came with revisionism, with this fascination of social science, which is absolutely understandable when we are dealing with democratic Western societies. Yes, but when there was this attempt of application of this framework into the Soviet Union, and with some shortages of this approach, because you had no sources, like even in 90s and later, we can talk about this later. It was not the same access to the sources like we had in the Western world. And also, generally, I can think that it is not very clear what was the influence. And I cannot state also that emigres had a special access to decision makers other than other European, US professors or experts from academia. However, let's say there were some cases like this of Brzezinski and this of Pipes, when they had something to say for the presidents and for American foreign policy as well. And I think that generally the trouble with Sovietology, also this this Sovietology practiced by emigres was were some illusions. However, emigres had no so many illusions. Generally, they shared some views of Sovietology of the times. What can be learned from the cases I described for you? I think, first of all, Leopold Łabędź, who was the editor of Soviet Survey and later Survey, yes, then he was co-editor with Walter Laqueur, published such a volume about no illusions. Is that we shouldn't have illusions about the Soviet Union, about Soviet Russia. I think that something, of course, it is very general indication and advice. I think that some works like on geopolitics by Brzezinski, some works about the nature of the system. When Pipes, for example, wrote his books on history of Russia and some continuation in this history. This book by Ulam, I hope, is for the first time translated into Polish. maybe you don't believe me, but it was never translated into Polish. It was published only in English, and we are doing this within this project. However, I think that when we read this book today, about sinusoid of Soviet policy, we have so contemporary thoughts in mind that many things are eternal or almost. And of course, the attitude toward nations. Yes, I think that the work started by Pipes, but also continued. I think that Professor Sporluk could tell us more about this. I think it was also an achievement of those times and those discussions. So to conclude, but not to finish, to conclude on the emigres, I think that they played a generally important role in Cold War American foreign policy, but they were also, at least some elite of them, very important knowledge producers and brokers, we could say. Yes, people who build the networks within Western world and between them to show certain type of analysis, of expertise, knowledge on the Soviet Union, not necessarily achievable at once after the Second World War, because they had experience. Because, for example, Sokienitsky, who was this researcher at Hoover Institution, he was not only Sovietologist before the war, but he also conducted the first investigation on Katyn massacre. And he was the first who prepared the report on this, anonymous, without his name, simply for the purpose of Polish government in exile. And then, of course, with some question mark, how significant, how powerful were the that networks? And here I don't have answer as 6 years ago, but I think that it shows something that we cannot ignore this phenomenon at least. And I have some postulates after all that some methods we, there is a shortage of this approach. The first is that we focused on Sovietologists from Poland. But I think that generally we should say about Central European Sovietologists or Central and Eastern European Sovietologists. Yes, or certain group of people of specific experiences from the interwar times, from the war times, and then from the times when Soviet Union was in power in the region. So it would be my dream, yes, if we have such a team working on broader picture, not only on those coming from Poland. And this postulate is, I hope we'll have this opportunity to cooperate. I would like to invite you now very generally, because next year we plan to organize in Lublin, in this Institute of Central Europe, the conference on a more global approach toward Cold War Sovietology. And I hope we'll discuss this more deeper. We'll meet some other colleagues and we'll try to go into this global perspective on Sovietology and Soviet studies and expertise in the Soviet Union, including not only, let's say, the Central and Eastern European countries and nations, but also some other countries which for sure had the expertise on the Soviet Union. And probably, because I have this one question for the end, but I think my time is finished. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks for the question, Slavik. When discussing the point you raised about how influential they were, I may come back to Martin about that. She was present in the White House with some of the people you mentioned, particularly Adam Ulam and Dick Pipes in 1986, I believe it was, when President Reagan was about to meet with Mikhail Gorbachev. So Nadia, if you could, your presentation is on here. Maybe if you can switch places.
Okay.
Just a moment.
Can it be expanded a little bit?
I want to see this.
Well, I would
So
like to
please.
see it better. Not. For coming to this seminar, it is very difficult to speak in front of such audience, especially when people who have been here for decades are presenting today at our seminar. And for me, this is a privilege to speak in front of you. So I would like to, my presentation was much longer. And initially, I decided to cover the period starting from 1917, from the Bolshevik Revolution, and then covering the rest in historical perspective, the US Sovietology. But hearing a presentation of Slavic, I would just concentrate on the Cold War with a few slides to leave sufficient time for discussion. So let me start with saying a few words. Maybe a few topics will coincide with your presentation, Slavic, but I'll try to be quick. So US Sovietology during the Cold War became one of the most important academic fields, encompassing a variety of disciplines. Practitioners aimed to study and explain Soviet system and the Soviet state. And the Soviet state. To the end, funding from the US government and also private organizations led to the establishment of research centers that focused on the USSR, notably the Russian Institute at the Columbia University and the Russian Research Center at Harvard University. I have to press it for you. So, I have a few slides of explaining the role, very short, of a few important figures at the Russian Research Center. Adam Ulam began his career at Harvard in 1947, but initially he was not focusing on the Soviet Union. By the early 1950s, however, he shifted his focus to detailed studies of Russian and Soviet history and Soviet foreign policy. He served as director of the Russian Research Center for 15 years and retired in 1992. And here you have, just a second, here you have a, I just copied, just this slide shows a memoriam, memorial notice about Adam Ulam by Mark Kramer that was published in the Journal of the Cold War Studies in the spring issue, number 2 in 2000. The world's foremost experts on the history of science and technology in the Imperial Russia and the USSR is Lauren Graham, who was also he also has been affiliated alongside with MIT, with Harvard for a long period of time. Among his influential books is Science and Philosophy of the Soviet Union, where he sought to explain how the USSR's officially approved framework of dialectical materialism had influenced the way Soviet scientists approached key fields, including quantum mechanics, relativity theory, cosmology, as cosmogony, genetics and origin of life, structural chemistry, cybernetics, and psychology and psychology. And he found that although the precepts of dialectical materialism in the USSR were often inimical to sound research and at the times highly destructive, many Soviet scientists were willing to embrace the framework and even try using it to their advantage. And here I copied a page from the Data Center website where a tribute to Lauren Graham was published on the 7th of January 2025. The next scholar, and already Slavik spoke about Brzezinski, but Brzezinski was one of the most prominent early Sovietologists, known initially for his work with Karl Friedrich on totalitarianism under the Nazi and Stalinist regimes. After Stalin's death, Brzezinski sought to explain why some of the worst features of the Stalin era did not carry over to the dictatorial regime under Khrushchev and Brezhnev. His role in studying the Soviet Union has recently been reappraised. And here is a also
I didn't orchestrate this.
our article by current director of the Cold War Studies, Mark Kramer, of Zbigniew Brzezinski and his role. This is a very critical article that it isn't. Well, I thought so. That says is Zbigniew Brzezinski writings on Soviet Union. Here I looking for Sovietology and the role of the discipline during the Cold War. I found a lot of reviews of books on Soviet policy, on Soviet economy, on Soviet culture, on perceptions in the United States to the Soviet Union as a model of socialism, and also according to even some American scholars, they regarded it as a model of the world. The others were, the vast majority of American scholars were very critical to the Soviet system and to the socialism and communism as a system. So here's just I wanted to show that even in that there is so many. For example, this is a review of written by Colin Welsh, The Real Soviet Union, the Use and Abuse of Sociology. He says critical and polemical is called, and this is a review of the book of Leopold Lebitz with the preface by Zbigniew Brzezinski and edited by Melvin Olasky. And it came out in 1998, and a few there's another also, this is now this is not review, but I just wanted to show the variety of people and scholars from different disciplines, political scientists, historians, economists. They tried to look from their point of view with their methodological approach to explain what was going on in the Soviet Union during socialism. And here I just chose an article by Robert Daniels, which was written in 1991 at the end of the Cold War, when in this article he raises the important question: is Sovietology that too as Soviet Union and the system itself? And here I chose just a few sentences from this article. He says that in the beginning of the article, very optimistic the introduction, the spectacular quote, the spectacular collapse of communist governments from the Elbe to Vladivostok is also going to have an earth-shaking effect in those Western and particularly American academic circles devoted to the sometimes occult discipline known as Sovietology. This may be defined as the study in political science and closely of related fields of the Soviet system of power and of other communist regimes, planted by Moscow or copied from it. For decades, the discipline has been a thriving academic industry. Now its reason for being has been wiped out. But then, after discussing the history of Sovietology during the Cold War, after discussing a few authors, Robert Daniels concludes saying that, quote, no, Sovietology is not dead yet and should not die. It does have to recognize, though, that many of its most cherished propositions are time-bound and have been shunted from the foreground into the background. That is not to diminish the role of Russian and East European studies. We need historical insight in order to understand the former communist bloc and the transformation is going through. Moreover, concludes Daniels, Sovietologists and their special lore now expanded will continue to be invaluable as West try to communicate with a part of the world that has won our sympathy and admiration, but may yet try our patience, our compassion, and our generosity. And let me say a few words about American Sovietology after 1991. When I think new opportunities for US scholars in Russian, Ukrainian, Baltic, and Moldovan archives became a reality. We all here in this room, I think, will agree that unprecedented opportunities to explore declassified documents in former Soviet archives became a reality and gave the opportunity for, especially for US scholars, to go in person and to pursue their research in different Russian-based archives. Also, a lot of memoirs and anthologies of declassified materials were available. Wealth of new scholarship in the former USSR in the West on the nature of the Soviet Union and Soviet foreign policy has appeared. And here are just few examples of the enormous literature, although Slavik already showed a few important books from that period. And here I'm showing, for example, the Stephen Kopkin's biography of Stalin, the William Stallman book, The Man and His Era, about Khrushchev, the fate of the Soviet bloc's military alliance by Mark Kramer. As far as I know, I'm not sure, maybe I missed, but this book, I don't know if it had, if you have a presentation of this book yet, but it came out. So the other books that I here prepared are a very impressive volume, Imposing, Maintaining, and Tearing Open the Iron Curtain on the Cold War and East Central and in Central Europe from 1945 to 1989, edited by Vít Smetana and from Czech Institute of Recent History, and Mark Bremer from Cold War Studies and Davis Center. And the other book that came relatively recently was a volume that was a result of at least 3-year long project that brought together scholars from United States, from Central and Eastern Europe, and also from Russia, the Soviet Union, and Cold War neutrality and non-alignment in Europe. This time edited by 3 editors, Mark Kramer, Ariel Makwa, and Peter Rugenthaler, who are Ariel Makwa and Peter Rugenthaler are also experts on the Cold War, but based in Europe. And of course, I think I should conclude with the Cold War Studies series and the Journal of Cold War Studies. And also here I see I'm missing the Cold War Studies book series. I should put also, I don't know how many books are already in this series altogether, but thank you very much for your attention. And this is a document from Ukrainian State Security Archive in Kiev, which has been I have been several times doing research there, and it is very welcoming archive that is doing a great job even now during the war. And during the CIS convention, I presented the director of the archive, KGB archive in Kiev, gave an excellent presentation showing the work that the archive is doing during the war now. Thank you very much for your attention.
That's lovely to come back here. So let me go back to that question about one thing that wasn't covered so much here, but certainly was covered here at the Russian Research Center, and then for a while at the Data Center, was the economy of the Soviet Union. There were major figures here, especially, I think Harvard was really the center of this, although it certainly wasn't the only one, but Abram Bergson, for example, Joe Berliner, who was at Brandeis, but was closely affiliated with this center, many others, Frank Holtzman, who was at Tufts, but again, closely affiliated here. How, because the economists were working with very spotty data and had to devise ways of trying to come up with reasonably accurate statistics. Bergson certainly gave a spirited try to do that, but in light of what we know now, that is with the declassification materials that Nadia was talking about, how would you look back on what was done by Sovietologists, particularly by the economists, in judging the Soviet economy? You could think of people like Janusz Kolyai, who was focusing more on East Central Europe, but did come up with concepts that were applicable to the Soviet Union as well, particularly the economics of scarcity and various principles that did contribute, I think, to the weakening of the Soviet economy. But there were many others as well who worked on East Central Europe and also devised ways of approaching the topic that could potentially be used to study the Soviet Union. The second question that I have, it has to do with foreign affairs and going back to what you raised before. I think both of you raised, but particularly you, Slavik, about the book that Adam Ulan published, Expansion and Coexistence, which I think the title actually quite accurately summarizes the thrust of the book. That volume came out in several editions, and I think at least 4 or 5, if I'm not mistaken. And the same with Merle Fainsod's book came out in, I think, 2 editions. He had the bad luck of putting the book out just before the power dynamic in Moscow changed. He put the first edition out, I think, about 6 months before Stalin died, and then he put the second edition out about a year or so before Khrushchev was ousted. But in looking at those successive editions of books, do you find that that it had caused any fundamental change in the way they understood Soviet foreign policies, or in the case of Fainsod, the nature of the Soviet system? And then the final question has to do with this actually goes back to a recently published book. It wasn't one shown by Nadia, but I hosted a seminar about it here fairly recently, which was by Michael David Fox about the crucible of power. And he goes back and looks at a book, looks at the same situation that Merle Fainsod had done in his first book, or one of his early books about the Soviet Union. It was the Smolensk under communist rule or under Bolshevik rule. And that book was based on documents that were captured by the Germans during the Second World War, and then ended up in U.S. hands and were archived for a long while, which is how Fainsod was able to use them. They were microfilmed subsequently and eventually transferred back to Smolensk after the Cold War. But what David Fox discovered as he was writing his book is that the documents Fainsod was using were only a relatively tiny percentage of the total, about 2% of the documents in the Smolensk archive for that period, not to mention the period after. And so it led to certain conclusions about Smolensk that weren't really borne out by the larger group of archival materials. So what do you find that applies more generally to Sovietology, given that the large majority of scholars had no access to any kinds of secret materials, except maybe some that were smuggled out from time to time? But so was it like looking at, looking at a racing car or something like that and trying to understand how it runs without being able to look under the hood? So in other words, the scarcity of evidence available to scholars, what sort of obstacle did that pose? Or do you think it fatally undermined what they were trying to do, or how did at least they get around it?
So you expect our answers now?
No, I'll actually take the question. So you can decide what you want to bucket those.
I have several questions. I was wondering to what degree you look at Problems of Communism, the magazine, in terms of the conveyor belt of scholarship to really the government. I mean, basically, Problems of Communism got started in 1952, and then it's probably post-communism. I don't know if it's still around. But I remember both when I was a student and then when I was in DC, everyone's reading that, and I thought that that is a very important thing to look at in terms of transmittal of information to people working for the government. I thought we did that. I'm going to just run through a lot of things. I just bought and I'm reading Edward Luce's book about Brzezinski, which I'm sure you've read, and I'm wondering what in the book do you think Luce has wrong? I mean, I'm reading it. For me, it's very interesting because I was a student here, undergraduate. I worked at Marshall Goldman, and I remember all these people, and there were sort of assumptions about all these individuals I didn't really know as a peer, as I was, a student. But I'm wondering, like, whether you read this and you found it to be on point in terms of accuracy. Two other quick things. In the late 70s, Jerry Huff was an important figure in Soviet studies. And he approached the whole field more like a social scientist. And he was very controversial, and his wife, Fitzpatrick, was also very controversial. And that was a big debate within the Russian research sector in terms of how much they should embrace him, because they found it very threatening, because these were like people who, took a sort of ideological approach, thinking that Soviet space is different than other, area studies, wondering whether we looked at that. And the last thing that I was throw out, you got to certain generations. I saw we got Paul Dobriansky, who I to play softball with, but you didn't get to another generation, which is important, which is we listed Sam Pizar. Sam Pizar was the mentor of Jeffrey Hertzfeld. I don't know if you know Jeffrey. Jeff Hertzfeld had the most prominent Russian practice of Western lawyers. He had office in Warsaw, Ukraine. I went to work for that law firm. The generation after that, when Hertzfeld started hiring lawyers for his practice, he took Russian studies people principally, but then went to law school. And so that influenced the whole sort of mindset of many of the Western lawyers who were in Russia doing stuff. So it's fun to throw it out. I'm part of that group that worked for Stefan Hertzfeld. But anyway.
Nina, please.
Yeah, just a couple of things. First of all, speaking to the economist, I mean, I thought the most brilliant was Leon Smolinski, who was a Pole and taught at Boston College. So he should be included. I also want to point out that Richard Pipes was not a Sovietologist. He was an historian. So say that. And I wanted to, and Bill Daniels also, and Robert B. Daniels is from Bill. Also an historian. What you had to say about revisionism Slavic was not very complimentary. And I wondered what authors you talked about and what views, and whether you think the older totalitarian model has not been expanded by and if you studying other aspects, non-aspects of so that's my questions.
And I'll take one more.
Actually, I have a question. Since I looked at your the title of the article and then some explanation of the contents, I was wondering, and that there you said, or the title or the explanation said that you'll be looking into the influence of the Sovietology on the Cold War. And, so I was wondering if you can add something on this. And in that long list of American Polish scholars, I'd like to add also the name of Adam Przeworski, who was actually writing on democracy and the market, working at the University of Chicago and then New York University. Leszek Kulakowski, who was working in, he was mostly a philosopher, but he was working in University of Oxford. But he had a lot of influence on American, on Sovietology in American, in America. And maybe also another economist is Jerzy Wilkin from University of Warsaw. He was an economist. Probably I'll add one lady, Anna Grzymała. She was working in I don't know if she's still working in the University of Stanford. And of course, current director of this center, Grzegorz Ekier, who wrote with Jan Kubik and Jan Zalok on civil society. So,
Yeah, but definitely not about facility.
right. Yeah.
All right, let me turn to the two presenters, and again, we can decide what we want to ask, but certainly Nina's point about totalitarianism, if you folks don't deal with it, I will. No, it's a
Nadia, would you
question.
like to start?
I wasn't saying I disapproved of it.
Nadia?
Well, okay, I'll start, but let me see what I can start with.
can
Maybe
choose
from
some questions,
there's so many questions, yeah. So the first question I think was about economy and how if I got it right, how U.S. scholars studied Soviet economies, maybe something like that. So I want to say that U.S. scholars, as I mentioned during my presentation, they have been always at least two groups: those who were more kind of hostile to the Soviet Union, to the Soviet economy, to the Soviet Soviet society, and to those who not admire, but kind of they would accept in a more friendly way some achievements in Russia and in the Soviet Union. So, for example, among those economists, Ludwig von Mises was Ludwig von Mises who condemned that socialism could not establish the mechanism for calculating economic activity, and thus the socialism wasn't able to stimulate people's work. Of course, he explained developed his thoughts in his works, and one of his works came out in 1951. It's called Socialism and Economic and Sociological Analysis. So at the same time, during the years of big depression, they were American scholars and American economists who would favor Soviet system because of the disaster that happened. So these external factors, as a Great Depression, brought to some people to the idea that maybe Soviet economy, Soviet system is better than the capitalism. So, for example, these are also that was years of the Great Depression, also 30s, late 1920s, early and mid 30s, and also the other external factors who also contributed to the view of American scholars improving the economies to the Soviet society was the Nazi coming into the Nazi regime, establishment of the Nazi regime, and the threat that it would bring, the threat of Nazi Germany. When I would say that.
But what
the
I'm
news-
wondering though, Nadia, is, to what extent did economists get things right about the Soviet economy? You mentioned Ron Mises, but there were numerous others who focused, because he did deal with the Soviet Union, but it wasn't really his specialty, whereas there were some economists who focused very directly on the Soviet Union, who spent their careers looking at it. I've named some of them, but there were others, and I'd be curious to hear Slavik what you would say about the smaller speed. So that's what I'm wondering is, how good do you think the tools were that they developed to understand the Soviet economy, given the often falsified nature of the data that they encountered?
Well, generally speaking, I will say that there were a lot of obstacles in front of United States economies. I'm not economist myself, so I didn't deal in depth with this issue. But I don't know to what extent we can say that they were very successful in assessing Russian and the Soviet economy because of the lack of data and the lack of truthful data. That was so. What they maybe they were having access to the scholarly works of Soviet scholars. Maybe the data that was officially designated by the Soviet ruling circles.
So if
But otherwise, they didn't have access to the material, to the documents as we do have now.
So if I may add something to this, because I totally agree that, let's say, shortages of materials, it was a very important factor. If we can learn anything from, let's say, those phases of Sovietology, is simply how to deal with something if we don't have access to the sources. Yes, and I'm sure that in many cases we will still have the same. So what framework should be applied? Can we say that political science can be helpful, or social sciences, or some others? If we are talking about statistics, yes, you need to have reliable data. If you don't have, simply any type of analysis will be the false one. However, your question, I think, we can treat more broadly that only Bergson, Gershon-Kron, Vassiliev, Alexander Ehrlich, whom I mentioned, who worked at Columbia, Smoleński, who was at Boston University. So generally, they dealt with different aspects. And I emphasized only Swianiewicz, who was this old generation Sovietologist from Poland, who saw some sources earlier and who did, let's say, research on analyzing not necessarily economic data and economic factors, but of functioning of the state, trying to conclude that, let's say, Gulag was necessary for the system to survive economically. So it was more political analysis, more based on administration, observation of administration, and so on and so forth. But of course, with some economic indications and conclusions.
That interpretation returned the post-Soviet period. That I think in many ways is quite convinced that the economic dimension of the Gulag was extremely important for Stalin. That's why you had the Gulag camps located in inhospitable areas where minerals could be mined and forced labor could be used. Paul Gregory and numerous of his co-authors put together 2 volumes on that subject.
Yeah, but there's another, to finish, let's say, the issue is another economist, Zalberman, who was of origin from Poland, and he wrote some works on central planned economy. And now we have colleagues who are dealing with his biography, trying to, let's say, reconstruct his thought and trying to even be inspired by his thought. But he was the emigre he wrote this in America. So it is extremely important thing, and we don't have. I think we don't have this overview which could allow us, or at least we need an economist among us to answer the questions. I know that we are running out of time, so I will try to address all the other things, unless Nadia, we would like to.
Go ahead.
Yeah, to at least shortly. I totally agree with you, Mark, about expansion and coexistence, and you're asking about Faisal and Ulam, how they changed their attitude. I was trying to follow the thought of Ulam when he started to write about so-called zigzag pattern. Because for the first time, he didn't use expansion and coexistence. He wrote about zigzag pattern in Soviet foreign policy for some year work on patterns of government in the 50s. And for the first time, he tried to do this. But the first time when he said it was something important, it was his report for Carnegie Foundation in 1949, which I discovered in the archives. He wrote this for Frederick Osborne, for the general, trying to explain what is the essence of generally the Soviet state and also foreign policy. And also very early he had some questions. And then, of course, I don't think he evolved very strongly, but simply he got some new type of knowledge as with new readings, with new things. I'm not sure how about Faisal. Generally, Faisal was his master in many things, and if you are asking about Faisal and Jerry Hugh, yes, it is another story and the book, and I will refer also to what Nina said just in a moment. Yeah. Problems of communism, if I may go further. Absolutely important title, and we take Abe Bromberg as a part of the networks built by the emigres. He was very, very young when he took, let's say, the editorial board of the journal, which was published by USIA, yes, so state agency, and the purpose was to spread the good, let's say, message to the world. Yes, that there is alternative for communism. Yes, because there are problems of communism, yeah, all over the world. And they publish this in different languages as well, if I remember. And my colleague, Alexander, is working precisely on the article on Bromberg, so I can put you in contact with him. Answering about Zbig, I will not refer to this book. I will say this. We still need a good biography of Brzezinski. I think that the best one we have now is by Vezet, who is now the advisor to Macron in France. And he worked on the archives. But I don't know, have you... It is in English. Yes, it is in English. Have you seen the archives, the papers of Brzezinski? This is the huge amount of papers written also in Polish. Many of them, many letters, many exchanges, and without reference to this, there's no biography which can be treated as reliable. Yeah, so simply this is here I will finish. And now you're asking about Jerry Hugh, Jerry Huff. I'm sorry, Jerry Huff. Yes, his wife and approach of social science. You are totally right. Yes, that I simplified revisionism to let's say applied or social science network. I will comment this with my personal experience. Well, because when I started this, I never thought that revisionism is something still alive. And when I went for the first time a few years ago to ACIS, I don't remember in which city it was, maybe in Philadelphia or something. And I saw, let's say, that the discussion between supporters of revisionism and, I don't know, Jonathan Daly, for example, writing biography of Richard Pipes, that it is still so vivid. From my, let's say, provincial police perspective, it was a discovery. So I'm trying to cope with this as a historian of a certain type of expertise, certain type of thinking. And in this sense, I think that there was certain, as a fascination with social sciences. And for example, in biography of Adam Ulam, I see this very strongly, this tension between political science, social sciences, history, treated as a certain empirical, let's say, material for political science analysis, for example. That here I see the beginning of the issue. But you're right that then we had different types of discussions. And let's say this book by Jerry Huff, which rewrite book by Fensod, is I think a certain also symbolic in this sense that he treated certain material prepared in former years, let's say, to pose completely different thesis. Yes, not how Russia is ruled, but how the system is governed, because he applied this political science framework, vocabulary into this. Don't treat this on my side as any type of criticism. Simply, I'm trying to understand, let's say, what were the elements of the discussion, and why happened what happened, and why there's still such a vivid discussion on this.
I'm around something on that. I used to do work under Jeff Simon, who looked at Eastern Europe a lot. And his whole thing was, it was like a class type thing. Huff was from a working class background of German background. He was not Eastern European. And so his perception of the United States was different than that of most Americans.
Yeah, again, though, that book.
Yeah, but you confirm me, let's say that this is still very vivid. Yes, it is. We could continue on this.
His original book, on the Soviet prefects, is actually a very good book. And remains so even now, after the opening of archives. Let me just say, though, the problem with the debate between revisionists and what traditionalists, or whatever you want to call them, is just that it became so polemical. It need not have been, but it was polemical on both sides. I mean, the revisionists made unjust accusations against some of the early scholars, implying that they believed that the Soviet Union had been totalitarian and would always remain so. That was never the case. If you look at Fensod's book on Smolensk under Soviet rule, you'll see that simply isn't the case. And the same with his books, how Russia is ruled. And the thing that Nadia showed on Brzezinski, he very quickly abandoned the totalitarian framework after Stalin's death. He didn't openly say that he was, but he did. By the 1960s, he was sponsoring or including, I think, in various political science journals, a bunch, but certainly in Soviet studies, a bunch of essays that looked at different aspects of Soviet history, including social history. So they were, I just regret that the whole debate became so polemical. And certainly Huff contributed to that, because he could be quite acerbic. But he was a good scholar. I regretted that by the end of his life, I think he died about 10 years ago, he was treated as a non-person by the Assis, because he had made some comments about violent crime in Baltimore that weren't regarded as appropriate. There was never an obituary published of him in the Slavic Review and all kinds of other things. So actually it turned around against him. In any case, let me just go back to Nadia for a second and ask her if could you comment, Nadia, on someone who actually grew up, at least your first, whatever it was, 18, 20 years in a communist system, how you and people around you perceive the Soviet Union? Did you regard it as something that was being emulated in Bulgaria, or did you look on it as something that would be avoided?
Well, I don't know to what extent this question is connected to the Sovietology, but Bulgaria was a part of the Soviet bloc and also OPEC countries. Although in Bulgaria, unlike in countries like Poland and like Czechoslovakia and like Romania and like Albania, they weren't. Such anti-Soviet demonstrations, and generally speaking, Soviet Union was regarded as and Moscow as the big brother, because it was the situation after the Second World War. Bulgaria was put by the great powers, by victorious powers, in the sphere of Moscow. And I think that also historically, if we look to the history of Russian-Bulgarian relations, there is a lot in this history that is very different from the bilateral relations in historical perspective between Poland and Russia, and then Soviet Union, then Czechoslovakia, and then and Soviet Union, because in Bulgaria there have been since establishment of the so-called Third Bulgarian state after the Berlin Congress and after in late 1870s, the Bulgarian third state was established thanks to the and as a result of again agreement between big powers and Russia and Russian Tsar had a big influence in Bulgarian society, but that does not mean that in Bulgaria there weren't so-called Russophilia and Russophiles and Russophobia and Russophilia they have been always part of Bulgarian society, and until now, even until today, no matter then Bulgaria took a democratic on the road of democracy and free capitalism in like 30 years ago. So Bulgarian society is still divided. Politicians are divided, and different circles of the society. They have different feelings to today's Russia, even in connection with Russian-Ukrainian war. So Bulgarian case is quite different, and Bulgarian during socialism had a kind of, it was treated kind of differently. It's definitely not like Poland, like Czechoslovakia, like Hungary, it was treated like their documents that saying there was rumors that it was treated like the 16th Republic of the.
Well, volunteered to become one. Let me because I need to be somewhere at 6. Let me just end on one last point, which is I wonder whether Sovietologists, despite the shortage or the scarcity of reliable information, understood the Soviet Union better than a lot of political scientists now understand decision-making in Putin's Russia. But that's something that we will be having a seminar about. So, okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
All.